All right. Well, thank you guys so much for again the opportunity to be with you all this morning. I'll start off and go over our theme verse. Our theme verse for the series is Psalm 90, verse 12. And it says, "So teach us to number our days that we may present to you a heart of wisdom." So we're going to cover today. Last week we did an overview of finishing well, and then we're going to look at each historical figure and how they finished well, finished okay, maybe didn't finish well, and we'll kind of go through their life. Today, we're going to talk about Hannah and Hannah learning to surrender under provocation. The Bible addresses the ideas of both provoking and then being provoked. And the Bible emphasizes the tools of self-control and patience, the fruits of the Spirit, which just happen to both be properties or sub-virtues of the virtue of fortitude, by the way, and then peacemaking and forgiveness, which are properties of the virtue of charity. Over and above having retaliation or negatively responding in anger. Hannah learned to surrender over time, and she finished well. So at the bottom of your notes, you'll see the quadrant of human nature from last week. This is for your personal use and reflection as we go throughout the whole series to kind of take some notes of maybe some stuff you note from each person, and again just to kind of reflect and to kind of look within ourselves and find some of those spots that kind of get us in trouble, and we all have them, don't we? So let's go ahead and dig in. First, I love context. This is set the stage. I'm going to show this every week just as a reminder of the Bible, the books of the Bible that were available to these historical figures during this time, because then you'll see what God's word says, and we'll see how they kind of go off script a little bit, or kind of go on script, and how they submit to God's word. So it's just important for context to see what they have. So let's go ahead and dig in to First Samuel and see if we can spot some of the problems along the way. Verse 1, there was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had two wives. One was called Hannah, and the other Peninnah. Boy, those pronunciations first thing in the morning with dry mouth and coffee was really fun. So Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Well, we notice the first problem in the context of which Hannah is living. And the first thing we need to remember when we read the Bible is that the Bible does not approve of everything it records. So again, pointing to your notes, we're going to go through the biblical method through all these series. We're going to do observation, what does the text say? Interpretation, what does the text mean? And then we'll end with an application of so what does it mean to us today? Well, here we see that first of all, he had two wives. The fact that the Bible does record the sins of the saints is a mark of authenticity and historical reliability, by the way. The Bible is really clear on its teaching regarding not having multiple wives. Well, Elkanah took the practice that was common during this time and he baptized it, if you will. The practice was to marry a second woman to give you children. If your first wife, either one, cannot have children, or two, doesn't have children fast enough for you. During this time, not having children was seen as a curse from God, but having children was seen as a blessing from God. And we see in Genesis 2:24 that it was available to him that Adam was to be united to his wife. It doesn't say for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to wives. We'll say his wife, and they will become one flesh. But we see the problem we have today. This could be a theme verse for today, and there's a theme verse back then that Judges 17:6 says that everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So let's go along with the rest of our text. But whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all of her sons and daughters. So they're all taken care of, had their needs met. Verse 5, but to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her and the Lord had closed her womb. And because the Lord had closed her womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her until she wept and would not eat. Now we see the problem, right? This went on year after year. Elkanah had made an idol out of having a child, so which is why he had two wives. He had two wives under one roof. He showed favoritism to Hannah because he loved her and he felt sorry for her. And this didn't go unnoticed to Peninnah, who was treated like property. She was a means to an end, which was to give him children, and she knew it. Peninnah knew she was unloved, but out of envy of the love that Hannah's being shown, well, it became recorded entry of another passive aggressive woman taking it out on the rival. Notice that her rival. Well, both, interestingly enough, women wanted what the other woman had, but losing focus on the blessing they did have. Peninnah had children, Hannah had none. Hannah had the love of her husband, Peninnah had none. So how long did this go on? Year after year. There's a lot covered in just these verses here, a lot of time. Let's continue. And she, Hannah, made a vow saying, O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. So we see here now, Hannah knew the word of God. We see Numbers 6 through 5. She's actually making a very specific vow that he would be a Nazarite. So let me read Numbers 6 for you. Verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, Speak to the Israelites and say to them, if a man or woman wants to make a special vow, a vow of separation to the Lord as a Nazarite, he must abstain from wine and other fermented drink. It must not drink vinegar made from wine or any other fermented drink. He must not drink grape juice or eat grapes or raisins. As long as he is a Nazarite, he must not eat anything that comes from the grapevine, not even the seeds or the skins. During the entire period of his vow of separation, no razor may be used on his head. He must be holy until the period of separation to the Lord is over. He must let the hair of his head, the hair of his head, the hair of his head grow long. Well, Samson was a Nazarite and is known to Hannah, whether it's through written word at the time or through the tradition, that she knew about Samson because Samson was one of the leaders during the time of Judges, of which this portion of the book is still in. This is why Samson couldn't cut his hair. It wasn't some mystical thing. It was because if the cutting of his hair, he would have broken his vow to God. A more modern Nazarite would have been John the Baptist. So John the Baptist was a Nazarite. Well, we see that what drove Hannah is in verse 16 says, I've been praying here out of great anguish and grief. So the provocation that she's been receiving from her rival, she moved from feeling sorry for herself to the arms of the loving God who loves her and who's sovereign over the situation she is in. So, how long did it take Hannah to get this point? Again, these verses cover a lot of time. So, it took her a while, just like you would expect it does us as well. So, how did God use Peninnah's provoking, quote, evil for good? Well, it drove her to God. Verse 19. Well, early the next morning they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to the home in Ramah. Elkanah lay with Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, Because I had asked the Lord for him. After he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. In the ancient Near East, time she was living, a weaning took about 3 years. So Samuel was 3 years old at this time. When they had slaughtered the bull, they brought the boy to Eli, and she said to him, As surely as you live, my lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I'd asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life, he will be given over to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord there. So Hannah gave her son up for adoption, keeping her vow to the Lord. But if you just pause for a moment and just reflect, how difficult do you think this was for Hannah? Went from having no children, making a vow to God, to having a child, weaning him for 3 years, and then giving him back over to the Lord. to keep her vow to God. It says a lot about her spiritual state this time as well. What about Samuel? 3 years old, given up for adoption. Then he's living with the evil stepbrothers. This is like, the story of Snow White, but kind of dealing with men here. The stepbrothers were evil, and you'll see that God's redeeming the priesthood here through Samuel. It's kind of a powerful movement of God's sovereignty throughout this whole time. Well, now this brings us to kind of digging in a little bit, right? What does it mean to provoke? Well, provoke comes from the Hebrew kas, and it means primarily to provoke to anger. So there's a goal to it, to cause irritation. I'm from Pittsburgh, and we have a uniquely Pittsburgh term for this very thing, and it's called a jag-off. The last thing you want to be is a jag-off in Pittsburgh. And it comes from there's these little round jagger things. I don't know if you ever got them caught in your pants or whatever, especially sweatpants when you're out walking. Those jagger bushes, we called them, were everywhere. And trying to pull them off was incredibly irritating. They stuck there. They continued to poke at you. So that's kind of a word for someone who causes irritation in Pittsburgh. So if there's a Pittsburgh version of the Bible, that's what we have. Well, I think of these with siblings. I have three kids, boy, girl, boy, and my youngest son, has my personality, a good sense of humor, and he provokes my older son. And my older son would just literally respond in such an over-the-top way that guess what became the focus of us parents? Well, it was the loudest thing first was Jonah, not Nathan's provocation. And he would get mad thinking that, well, he did this. And I don't know if you've ever seen this with siblings. And Nathan would just go, but he's so easy, Dad. I'm like, but son, you don't provoke him because you're doing it for the wrong reasons. You're trying to stir a reaction. So he had to learn not to do that. My son, who was the provoked one, had to learn don't go over the top because you're going to lose every time. Because guess what happens, right? That becomes the issue, and you lose what causes it. So it's not a good thing. But I want you to notice when Peninnah provoked him. I'm sure she provoked her constantly, but the Bible really focuses on this time of the year when they're going up to worship. Year after year, whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. This time when she goes up to Shiloh with Samuel, it's the first time we see her involved in worship activities, the sacrifice and so forth. So I don't know if that you can deduce that she stayed home. I don't know. But the provocation was the main focus for her. In ancient Israelite culture, emotions such as anger were understood as powerful forces that can disrupt community, harmony, one's relationship with God and others. And we know this today. Hannah's response, right, was not to worship God, but to feel sorry for herself. She went inward and grieved and wept. And you can understand it for a time, but there's a time you got to get out of that, as Ecclesiastes tells us. There's a time for everything, but you got to move out of it. Do you think that she was blaming God during that time, maybe, for her situation? Well, probably. That's natural, but you got to move out of that. Well, Peninnah had a goal, the Bible tells us, of making Hannah react, and it worked. The provocation was winning. And we see that Hannah fell for it for years until she moved from focusing on Peninnah to focusing on God. Just because Peninnah viewed Hannah as a rival didn't mean that Hannah had to do the same thing in return. So, what was the result? Well, she learned to trust God's sovereignty and timing, to be thankful, to embrace the blessing while being equipped to count the cost of making and keeping the vow to God. And as a result, God ended up blessing Hannah, we see later on, with five more children. Well, in turn, because of her obedience that extended to the rest of us, the nation of Israel was blessed with the prophet Samuel, who was responsible for uniting the nation under a king. That was the priest's job. That was the judge's job, the role he played as a prophet, because Lord knows that Eli's sons were not equipped to do it. So let's move along here to what the Bible says about provoking. So I'll show some negative verses that talk about provoking and some positive ones, right? You can use it for good. So let's look at some of the negative ones. We see this twice about fathers, and then you could extend it out if you want into the broader view of leadership in your workplace. Fathers Do not provoke your children, or they'll become discouraged. So we see that there's results constantly provoking your children. Look, our job is to be so in tune with our children, to be students of our children, like we are with our spouse, that we transition. We're supposed to help mom really transition from looking at the son as a little boy to a young man in the teenage years, and we just can't keep provoking them and pointing out their bad parts, whatever that looks like, right? We don't want to do that. Can be discouraging. Let us not become conceited. Sometimes we puff ourselves up and then provoking and envying each other. Galatians 5:26 tells us. We can provoke God. And let me tell you something, there's a lot of verses about provoking God. Are we trying to provoke the Lord to jealousy? So the Bible uses idolatry and puts that in the category of adultery. So idolatry and adultery look the same. But if you think about it, right? Why? Because if you're putting your heart towards something that's an idol in your life, whether it's metal or mental, right? Not choosing not to renew our mind, whatever that is, it provokes the Lord to jealousy. Well, why? Because he loves us. He wants us to trust him and have our affections for him. It's kind of like adultery. If I saw my wife showing affections toward another man all the time, well, it's going to provoke me to jealousy, rightfully so, right? So we don't want to provoke the Lord. Then you have provoked the Lord to anger by your deeds. It moves along here. There's tons of verses here. In the New Testament, you got 1 Thessalonians 4:8, Hebrews 3:8, 10, and 17. You got tons of verses in Proverbs. I mean, I could have went on and on. So I just said the Bible. Active, consistent disobedience, refusal to submit to God is the sin of pride holds all that up. And those chickens will come home to roost. Maybe we'll give you good eggs, but those chickens will come home to roost. So let's look at the positive. Let us stir, let's provoke one another towards love and good deeds. So there's a positive way we can provoke one another. How about this one? In 1 Corinthians 13:5, agape love is not easily provoked. So the word love there in 1 Corinthians 13 is agape love. And agape love is self-sacrificial and it's unconditional. So it's other-centric. You're the sacrifice when you are loving someone. You are putting your needs lower than those of the beloved. So agape love is not easily provoked. If you agape love someone, you're not going to be easily provoked by them. Well, what does it mean to be provoked? Well, there's two types of people, right? So we've got the provoking person, right? Sometimes someone's provoking you. And then we got myself, if I'm the one being provoked, right? So the provokee, if you will. So the giving and the receiving. So there's two types, right? Provoking and then being provoked. Well, someone who's provoking you can have a negative goal, and a negative goal will stir a negative reaction. So the provoker one. Oftentimes it's motivated by sin. If you look at the quadrant, right, that black box, envy, selfish ambition, and etc. I love Thomas Aquinas's definition of envy. It's sorrow at another's good. I seen this during promotion season at work once, where one of my team members got promoted and the others didn't. And I tell you what, I was quite disappointed in the leader's reaction to one of them being promoted and the others not. It was more like, oh, they were, sorrow at the good of someone else. They couldn't even celebrate the person who's promoted. And that tells me a lot about those leaders and actually their readiness for promotion, doesn't it? Well, you can react in anger in a sinful, full, and unproductive manner. There's nothing wrong with being angry, right? It says the Bible teaches us to be angry, but not to respond out of that, right? Be angry, but do not sin. So you don't want to react in an unproductive manner. So you need self-control, right? Sometimes provoking is unintentional. Maybe someone hits a button of sensitivity that you have, and they don't mean to. If it's somebody very close to you, well, we gotta be careful that we don't accuse somebody of something they didn't do because they hit a button of sensitivity. Maybe it's an insecurity, it's rooted in past hurts. Of all those, there's a lot of things that can cause, right? Because a lot of times it may be unintentional, and we don't want to accuse our brother and sister or another person made in God's image for provoking us on purpose. And provoking can be done by behavior, not just with words, right? Again, that negative use of the anger language of being passive aggressive, right? Both unintentional or intentional. It could be so being provoked could you could be impatient or someone hits that past hurt, or I like to say they do a cannonball into your limbic system, which is the part of the brain that holds all those old memories from the past, and they bring them forward. They didn't realize they hit it, but they know by your reaction that something happened. When you're provoked by someone close to you and someone who loves you, what is needed is to keep the sin nature in check. Or as the old saying goes, I think it's in a rap song, right? Check yourself before you wreck yourself, right? You want to check yourself, that black box, from poisoning the rest of who you are and in your personality reacting. We're here, what's needed to keep you in check are the virtues of justice, assuming the best in others and so forth. And charity, the virtue of charity, which is rooted in agape love, knowing that your reaction or overreaction can and will damage a relationship. Remember, agape love is not easily provoked. With that, we'll kind of go to some more discussion questions. So I'll kind of lay this out there about being provoked. We've all been provoked. I have hot buttons, let me tell you. I have, because of the leadership gifts I have, I spot that selfish ambition like no tomorrow. And oh, it drives me insane when I see someone running around and look for promotion, stepping on others, or kingdom building instead of bridge building. Oh, drives me crazy, right? So I got to watch how I react because, man, over time that just builds. But what's a hot button, right? What provokes you, whether it's intentional or unintentional? Is it, something you're extra sensitive to, maybe being left out or someone bragging, or maybe they're not really bragging, they're just sharing something positive and you take it as bragging because you're in a negative spot right now, whatever, or just someone who's a liar, like whatever those types of things are. There's a lot of things that can go into that list, but whatever provokes you, maybe it jumped into your mind while you're listening to the definition and the lesson. Or how can you surrender your response now? That's at Romans 12:17 through 19. Don't take revenge, right? Don't return evil for evil. Then, right in the middle of it, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with all men. And then the next verse is what? Hey, listen, leave room for God's wrath. He'll do it better and cleaner. So trust God to take care of it. I had this happen in my workplace recently, dealing with provocation, and it was killing the teams. It really was. We're still dealing with the damage of, but God took care of it, and both of those men were fired. I don't like anyone being fired, but when someone's trying to get people fired in kingdom building, seeing the chickens come home to roost, glad God took care of it. But I try not to be too joyful because that in itself is a sin, right? It's provoking me to be joyful about something negative instead of feeling sorry for them. And hopefully they learn their lesson in their next workplace. Or how can you redeem that response and surrender to God? Maybe you're in the middle of something now. Maybe you have a broken relationship because someone provoked you and you responded, right? Use charity, the agape love, apply God's truth to fight the indifference to that broken relationship. I shared with you the link in last week's notes on broken relationships God's way. Make sure you do your part as far as it depends on you. It's good to assume you didn't always recheck that and make sure you own your response, but don't let what provoked go unaddressed, but make sure you own it. Why? Because your response is your responsibility. My response is my responsibility. God's math is that humility is greater than pride. Seeking forgiveness is greater than stubbornness. With that, I'm going to hand it over to my good friend Phil for the breakout time. Thanks, Phil.